handout today for, I don't know, the person who was in charge of doing it has not. So the subject that we'll be addressing today for now is a mystery. Oh, they gave it away. All right. Well, then it's Afghanistan. Okay. All right. We can start. But before we address the topic of the day, I'd like to come back to follow up very briefly on the American peace plan that you remember we discussed 2 weeks ago. You remember that I told you that the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas was coming to the United Nations at that time to seek a resolution condemning the American peace plan. Well, he did come to the United Nations, but was not successful in even getting such a text presented before the Security Council for adoption. Even a watered-down version of the initial text, as the United States applied strong diplomatic pressure on the other 14 members of the Security Council. As a result, Abbas went home empty-handed. His position as head of the Palestinian Authority shakier than ever, and pondering his next move, which might be the convening of an international peace conference on the Middle East. But this idea is not new, has been put forward by the Palestinian Authority many times before, and also rejected in the past many times by the Israeli side, which claims that only direct negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis can bring about a peaceful settlement in the region. Also last week, Secretary Pompeo traveled to the region, to the Middle East, particularly to Saudi Arabia and Oman in the Gulf, officially to discuss one more time the Iranian threat in the region, but also unofficially to seek support from the US allies for the American peace plan. Well, we'll see how everything will develop, obviously, since everybody's waiting for the outcome of the Israeli parliamentary election, which is scheduled for next Monday, March 2nd, before deciding how to proceed. In the meantime, today, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to address the recent resumption and maybe successful conclusion of closed-door negotiations between the United States and the Taliban in Afghanistan. Those negotiations were held in Doha, Qatar, and their aim was to finalize an agreement that would put an end to Washington's 18-year war in Afghanistan. The agreement should be made public by the end of this month. In a statement issued last Friday in Oman, Secretary Pompeo, who again was in the region, indicated that if a suspension in fightings in Afghanistan, which was supposed to go into effect last Friday, would be successful for the next week, for the next 7 days, then the agreement between the two parties would be signed in Doha on February 29th. So that's next Friday. We'll see. This agreement would set a conditional timetable for the U.S. to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan in exchange for Taliban's commitment to suppress terrorist groups' activities and open peace talks with the Afghan government, and should come into effect barring last-moment complications, which can always occur. The deal is controversial. Its supporters view it far preferable to the present status quo, which is a bloody battlefield stalemate, and also as a necessary first step towards any deal among Afghans to end the war. On the other hand, its critics worry that the deal sells out Washington's Afghan allies and provides cover for a troop withdrawal that President Trump wants, regardless of whether it makes diplomatic or military sense. But let's see first what the reality on the ground is today. The US has been fighting in Afghanistan the longest war in history. More than 2,300 US military personnel have lost their lives there, and an additional 20,000 were wounded. At least 500,000 Afghans, government troops, insurgents, Taliban mostly, and mostly also civilians, have been killed or wounded. Washington spent there close to $1 trillion in 18 years. And yet, even though the Al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden, is dead, and no major terrorist attack on the US homeland has been carried out by terrorist groups based in Afghanistan since 9/11, the US has been unable to end the violence, or at least reach a point where the violence is low, sufficiently low, or the Afghan government is sufficiently strong to allow US military forces to withdraw without significantly increasing the risk of terrorist threat there. The reality is that after 18 long years of war, no Afghan government can survive without the US backing. At this point, I'd like to remind you just briefly a few facts about the origins and the course of the conflict there. In October 2001, as you know, President George W. Bush launched an invasion of Afghanistan in retaliation for the 9/11 attacks. In the months that follow, US and Allied forces, the Allied forces were made up of basically troops from NATO member states, and also local allies, particularly one faction called the Northern Alliance. Chased out Al-Qaeda and upended the Taliban regime. Bin Laden fled to Pakistan, and the leader of the Afghan Taliban, Mullah Omar, took to the mountains. Taliban commanders and fighters either returned home to their villages or escaped to safe havens in neighboring Pakistan. Diplomatic efforts spearheaded by a US special envoy established a process in Afghanistan that created a new Afghan government led by Hamid Karzai at the time. For the next 4 years or so, Afghanistan was deceptively peaceful. The casualties of the US military were very low, allowing President Bush to maintain a relatively light presence in Afghanistan, around 8,000 troops in 2002, whose main objective and priority was to complete the defeat of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and help set up a new democracy in Afghanistan. The idea was to withdraw eventually, but there was no clear plan for how to make that happen, other than killing or capturing Al-Qaeda leaders and Taliban leaders. Still, political progress was real. In January 2004, a new constitution was approved, and parliamentary and presidential elections were held. However, in Pakistan, next door, I guess you have the map, and you can follow it on the map, the Taliban were rebuilding. Training and recruitment moved forward, and senior commanders started infiltrating back into Afghanistan. Violence in Afghanistan increased gradually, and then in early 2006, the Taliban went on offensive. Thousands of insurgents overran entire districts and regional capitals of Afghanistan. Over the course of the next 3 years, the Taliban captured most of the country's south and much of its east. US forces and their allies were engaged in heavy fighting. By the end of 2008, the US troop levels had risen to 30,000 without being able to contain the tide and the gains made by the Taliban. Yet the overall strategy had not changed. The Bush administration remained determined to defeat the Taliban and win what the president called at the time a victory for the forces of liberty. After winning the 2008 election, President Obama vowed to turn around what many in his administration considered as a good war, as opposed to the war in Iraq, which was considered to be the bad war, and that many in his administration saw as a lost cause. Obama opted to send reinforcement to Afghanistan, putting the total number of US troops in the country to close to 100,000. But the objective of the mission became less ambitious. It was no longer about defeating the Taliban no matter what, but rather removing the terrorist threat to the American homeland by denying Al-Qaeda safe haven in Afghanistan and strengthening the Afghan security forces. The plan also called for a reduction in troops by mid-2011 and eventually the transfer of full responsibility for the country's security to the Afghan government. Over the next 3 years, the US military surge was successful in stabilizing the country, in revitalizing the Afghan army and police, and in rallying support for the government. And the threat from Al-Qaeda also fell after the death of bin Laden in 2011 at the hands of US Special Operation Forces in Pakistan. However, success came at a very high price. Between 2009 and 2012, more than 1,500 American soldiers and military personnel were killed, and over 15,000 wounded. More American casualties than during the entire rest of the war in that country. At the height of the surge, the US was spending approximately $110 billion a year in Afghanistan, roughly 50% more than the total federal spending on education. As a result, Obama came to see the war effort as unsustainable and laid out a schedule to draw down US military forces to zero, with the exception for a small American presence at the US Embassy in Kabul by the end of 2016. So by the end of 2015, less than 10,000 troops were still in Afghanistan, from 100,000 to 10,000, focusing mostly on counter-terrorism and on advising and training the Afghan troops. And yet, battle after battle, numerically superior and well-supplied American Afghan forces ran instead of facing and fighting the Taliban. By 2016, the Afghan government was weaker than ever before, and the Taliban held more ground than at any time since they had been overthrown in 2001. That situation pushed Obama to suspend the drawdown. When President Trump took office in January 2017, the war was raging on. Trump initially approved an increase of US troops in Afghanistan to roughly 14,000. And this is more or less the number of troops, of American troops today in Afghanistan. However, Trump never made a secret out of the fact that he disliked that war. And looking for an exit, started negotiations with the Taliban in 2018. Negotiation which seemed to be about to bear fruit very soon. But before we take a look at the agreement, let's try and understand why successive American administrations have failed to end the war in Afghanistan. There are basically three factors. There is what I would call the external influence, the internal situation in Afghanistan, and some US missed opportunities. The first factor was, and still is actually, the external influence of Pakistan, country whose constant strategy in Afghanistan has been shaped by its regional rivalry with India. For instance, in 2001, at the beginning of the US military campaign in Afghanistan, Pakistan officially cut off support for the Taliban at the request of the Bush administration, only to resume it soon after, for fear that India was gaining influence in Afghanistan. Let's not forget how the Taliban movement was born. The Taliban movement basically was born during the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, when thousands of Afghan orphans, kids in their 10s and 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old children, whose parents had died in all this bombing and fighting in Afghanistan, were sent to religious schools, or what they call madrasis, in Pakistan, schools which were funded by Saudi Arabia in Pakistan, with the idea for the Pakistanis anyway, to use later on as proxy fighters against India in the Muslim populated Kashmir. But this Taliban, which means student actually, this Taliban joined Mullah Omar in Afghanistan. Mullah Omar was a simple Afghan preacher in Pakistan. He joined Mullah Omar after the withdrawal of the Soviet troops, when the civil war in Afghanistan started between regional factions and the government in Kabul, which had been put in place by the Soviet Union. So the Taliban came into fighting in the name of religion. They had been, I wouldn't say brainwashed, but they had spent a number of years in these madrasas, in these religious schools. And so they showed determination, and slowly they defeated the warlords in Afghanistan and established a brutal and totalitarian regime in Kabul, overthrew the government put in place by the Russians, the Soviet Union at the time, and took power in 1998 or 1999. A long succession of American leaders tried to change Pakistan's policy in Afghanistan, but to no avail. This is the first factor. The second factor is what I call an internal factor, which is that in the eyes of most Afghans, the Taliban fighters, no matter what their flaws are, regardless of their flaws, they still symbolize resistance to foreign occupation. This is an idea that runs deep in the Afghan culture. In light of successive invasions that country endured over time, invasions that had always been repelled, gaining Afghanistan the name of graveyard of nations. Today is the presence of Americans in Afghanistan, like that of the Soviet troops before it, and like that of the British presence before it, is considered in Afghanistan by most Afghans, Taliban or not, an assault on what it means to be Afghan. It inspires them, not only Talibans, but the rest of the population, to defend their honor, their religion, and their homeland. In contrast, most Afghans see their government tainted by its alignment with foreign occupiers. Before it was the Soviet Union, today it is the United States, and are not particularly motivated to fight for it. It did not help either that the Afghan government and its warlord allies were corrupt and treated the Afghan population badly by stealing their land, by providing jobs, gainful employment as patronage, and even using American special operation forces to fight their political rivals. This mistreatment pushed a number of Afghan tribes into the arms of the Taliban, providing the movement with sanctuaries, with fighters and a support network. Washington could probably have done more to address the corruption issue in Afghanistan. And with the grievances addressed by the Afghans under the new regime and the US occupation, by removing the worst offending officials from their positions and making US assistant contingent on reforms, but opted not to do so. That being said, probably to be fair to the American administration also, there is probably no real solution that could have denied the Taliban some support base. And finally, the missed opportunities. In the early stages of the war, roughly between 2001 and 2004, when the Taliban were in disarray, population support for the new government was relatively high, as was its patience with the foreign presence. The Bush administration made a couple of key mistakes in retrospect. It's easier to find them today than it was probably at the time. The first one was to exclude the Taliban from the post-invasion political settlement in Afghanistan. At the time, senior Taliban leaders seemed willing to lay down their arms and to recognize the Afghan government put in place by the United States. But they were turned down by Washington, which made them feel somehow foreigners in their own country, with no word with no say in what was going on after they had been overthrown. The second mistake was to move too slowly to build up an Afghan army. A year passed before Washington committed to building and funding a small Afghan national army of about 70,000 troops. However, by 2006, that was 5 years later, only 28,000 soldiers had been trained, so that when the Taliban went on the offensive and crossed the border, there was not much to stop them. Why these miscalculations? Well, basically because the Bush administration presumed that the Taliban had been defeated, disregarding evidence, ignoring evidence that they were staging a comeback next door in Pakistan, and turning their attention once again to Iraq. So in light of these high costs and slim benefits of the war, you may wonder, why hasn't the United States declared victory and simply left Afghanistan? Especially the day after bin Laden was killed in May 2011, when polls indicated that more than 60% of Americans believed that the US mission in Afghanistan had been accomplished by killing Osama bin Laden. There are two major reasons. The first one is that there were concerns, very real concerns, about the ability of the Afghan military to contain the resurging Taliban. And second, the rise of the Islamic State, ISIS, in Syria and Iraq in 2014, and the subsequent string of terrorist attacks in Europe and the United States suggested to the US commanders that terrorist groups could once again establish safe havens in Afghanistan. Also, the notion that the US could just leave Afghanistan presumes that the US president is free to just pull the plug as he pleases. In reality, getting out is nearly, if not more difficult, than prevailing. It is one thing to promise that the US would leave in the near future, and it's quite a different one to just depart. After giving a very thoughtful consideration to all possible consequences of such a withdrawal, including the risk of the resumption of terrorist attacks planned in Afghanistan and carried out back home after the 9/11 tragedy. So far, Donald Trump, probably the US president with the least patience for the mission in Afghanistan, has been faced with a similar dilemma. With him determined to leave and looking for an exit, as I mentioned earlier, substantive talks started in 2018. The negotiations made quick progress by offering a timetable for the gradual departure of US troops in return for the Taliban commitment to engage in negotiation with the Afghan government, which they do not recognize up to today. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, they had absolutely no say in its composition, in its establishment. To reduce violence while the two sides worked towards a comprehensive ceasefire, and to suspend aid to Al-Qaeda, in other words, to stop giving them sanctuary, or other terrorist groups. Over the course of 9 rounds of talks, the two sides developed a draft agreement. And last year, Trump even toyed with the idea of convening a conference at Camp David in September, where the deal would be announced. But he canceled the meeting when the Taliban demanded that the agreement be signed as a precondition for their participation in the Camp David meeting, and escalated their attacks in Afghanistan, killing an American soldier and wounding many more. However, a couple of months later, after an exchange of prisoners, the administration resumed the talks with the Taliban, and they seem to be going towards a successful conclusion, as Secretary Pompeo's statement seemed to indicate. If so, the actual departure of US troops would be contingent on the Taliban opening good faith negotiations with the government in Kabul. As only inter-Afghan dialogue can lead to a peaceful and permanent settlement in Afghanistan. However, these negotiations might take years to conduct and resolve, as their complexity is daunting. Among the major issues are Afghanistan's future form of government. Today, all non-Taliban Afghans embrace the form of democracy which was put in place after 2001, while the Taliban expect a more Islamic type of governance. So some new balance between religious and secular institutions must be found, which will not be easy. A second issue relates to the fundamental rights of Afghan citizens, especially women, who, as you know, were prevented from working or attending school under the Taliban. Today, basic rights for women are guaranteed in the 2004 Constitution. And Afghan women groups are adamant that the country must not revive the abuse of the Taliban regime. And finally, the fate of tens of thousands of prisoners, most of them Taliban. Today, most Afghan leaders appear inclined to release the majority of those fighters, to forgive their crimes, and help them gain employment as a price to pay for peace. But even such a magnanimous proposal comes with serious challenges. For instance, disillusioned the Taliban might join other terrorist groups after the fightings are over. Also, Taliban might resist demobilizing even under a peace agreement. Or the victim of those abuses might oppose impunity for the Taliban murderers. And whatever happens in those negotiations, the reality is that Afghanistan's poor economy will struggle, to say the least, to absorb tens of thousands of young men. So reintegrating these fighters into society will take years of hard work, even if the parties agree on principles at the outset. Well, none of this can change the fact that Afghanistan has been America's longest war in history, and that a US Taliban agreement may still fail to deliver the very same outcomes that the US military has been seeking for more than 18 years. But again, at the end of the day, peace in Afghanistan depends, and only depends, on the Afghans themselves. Otherwise, no matter what the efforts of the United States could be, any type of agreement or ceasefire or will crumble or collapse, and the fighting will go on. Now, just for your information about Afghanistan, it has a population of roughly 32 million, and its two major ethnic groups are the Pashtun, about 43% of the population, and the Tajik, which represent about 28% of the population, and the Hazara, 10%, who are mostly Shiite. Afghanistan being in its large majority a Sunni country. And also, to make it clear to you, one other thing that probably hasn't been, I haven't seen anyway too much in the newspapers, the difference between the Taliban, for instance, and ISIS. You might be wondering why there is no ISIS presence in Afghanistan, like in Iraq or in Syria, in other countries in the region. That's because the principle on which the Taliban were founded and ISIS were founded are very different. ISIS wanted to create a caliphate all over the area in the region. And they were successful to some extent in creating this caliphate in Iraq, in parts of Iraq and Syria. While the Taliban, as I mentioned to you earlier, who are they? They are basically young Afghan youngsters who have their roots in Afghanistan. They never wanted to create or to spread whatever beliefs they had all over the region. It is still remains rooted in local in Afghanistan. They never fought anywhere else. However, even though they differ on their objective, Taliban do not get along with ISIS, but they did get along with Al-Qaeda. Why with Al-Qaeda? Because Al-Qaeda did not want to create, unlike ISIS, it did not want to create a caliphate in the region. Al-Qaeda was only trying to plan terrorist attacks in Afghanistan, but that would not be carried out in Afghanistan against the Afghan population. They would be carrying out abroad, somewhere else, universally, against the infidels outside the region, where the Taliban were fighting in their own country only. So what the Taliban did, what Mullah Omar did for bin Laden, when he gave him sanctuary and let him stay in Afghanistan, was to give him the possibility of planning terrorist attacks, which were again carried out somewhere else. And that was the condition on which Al-Qaeda could operate in Afghanistan. Not against the Afghan, the other Afghan factions, but outside Afghanistan, and not in Muslim countries also, but outside that area in the United States, or as proven by the 9/11 tragedy, or in other parts of the world, like in Europe. So this is the difference. To you, it might not seem very wide, but there were instances where these differences pitted the Taliban against ISIS, actually. And there were times where the Taliban had to fight ISIS. And as a matter of fact, ISIS know very well that they are not welcome in Afghanistan. Therefore, they don't have a presence in Afghanistan because they know how strongly the Taliban are opposed to them. So this is, in a nutshell, the story of these three major terrorist groups. That being said, Al-Qaeda and ISIS don't get along very well either. So that to some extent it helps. They absolutely do not want to create a common unified front against the rest of the world. So this is where we're at today, and maybe by Friday we'll see that what happens next Monday. Maybe by Friday we'll have a successful outcome. I don't know. Once again, the signing of this agreement is definitely encouraging. It's a first step in the right direction for the U.S. Troops to come home eventually. It would be a gradual withdrawal. The troops will not be pulled out. The 14,000 people today, soldiers or military personnel in Afghanistan, would not be pulled out from one day to next. They would be pulled out gradually, and it remains to be seen if, like in Syria, the U.S. would maintain special operation forces, a small number of special operation forces in Afghanistan, like I say, like in Syria. But that would be just the first step. And to show how anxious the United States is to sign this agreement is the fact that they gave the Taliban 7 days to show good faith and stop fighting. Well, 7 days is not really a very long time. They could have asked for a month or 2 or 3 to stop fighting, but all they asked the Taliban is to suspend the fighting for 7 days. So they really would like this to succeed. That being said, again, this would be just the first step. How the Taliban would react afterwards, and how, in what spirit they would get into real negotiations, which they always refuse to have with the Afghan government in Kabul, remains to be seen. It doesn't help also that Afghanistan has 2 governments. You might have heard they had elections in September, and the incumbent, finally the results after 3 months came out. It's like Iowa. Came out, and the incumbent, President Ghani, was reconfirmed as president of Afghanistan. But immediately the outcome was challenged by his main opponent, Abdullah, who accused the other side of fraud. So, and who decided, despite the outcome and the results, to contest the elections, and not only that, but to form an Afghan government. So now you have two governments, one which is probably officially recognized by the United States, Ghani's government, but then you have a second government which might not recognize the agreement between the United States and the Taliban, which won't make it easier when it comes to negotiating directly with the Taliban. So we'll see what happens. But this might take a very, very long time to bear fruit or to come to a successful conclusion. So we'll see. We have many years to discuss Afghanistan in the future. All right, so we'll resume in 5 minutes. Thank you. All right. Let's resume if you don't mind. Do we have a micro? No, we don't have a microphone, Justice.
Is it on?
Yes.
It's on, I presume? Yes. I have actually two questions, both real short. The first question is these other stands that are around, including Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, all the bordering stands. How were they formed? Were they arbitrarily formed like so much of the Middle East, or did they kind of form themselves from the various tribes?
Okay. That is your first question, right?
That's question one. I'll give you the second. I'll give you the
No,
second.
no. It's okay. Let me answer the first. I might not remember the second.
I might not remember it either.
First of all, the countries which were formed in the Middle East were not formed arbitrarily. They were formed by the colonizer, basically.
Well, yes, outside.
That's
India.
what you meant?
Yeah, that's basically.
Well, it's not quite arbitrary. Basically, you have two major powers in that. First, it was the Ottoman Empire, right, up to the end of the First World War. And after that, when with the creation of the modern Turkey and the implosion of the Ottoman Empire, then the French and the British came in. The French in Syria and Lebanon, as you know, and the British in what is today Jordan and Iraq, for instance. So they are not arbitrarily established those borders. They were established between France and England. Now, that's number one. Number two is all these ex-Soviet republics that you refer to, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, they are not formed arbitrarily. They are what they used to be under this, except that the name was the Soviet Union, and they were part of the Soviet Union. So when also the Soviet Union broke up, these countries kept their borders. There were no transfer of population or movement. The borders did not move. They kept the same borders that they had, except that before they were not real borders. They were just, going from one region to the next part of the Soviet Union. Do not forget Ukraine, Belarus were also part of the Soviet Union, and when they became independent, like all these ex-Soviet states, they kept their borders. So there were no changing borders after the Soviet Union has exploded. Sorry? Yes. Well, I didn't want to go back to Stalin. Yeah, but Stalin, there were a few changes, and under Khrushchev also there were a few changes. Particularly topical is Crimea, which was part of the Soviet Union before Khrushchev, and Khrushchev, for whatever reason, but since they are both part of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, administratively speaking, gave back the administration of Crimea to the Ukrainian authorities. But the population in Crimea up to today is in majority Russian. and Russian-speaking. That's why, in a way, it was so easy for Putin to reclaim Crimea, in a way. This is your first question?
Yeah, the second part of the question is, how come, again, these border countries are not fighting the way Afghanistan is fighting? How come there is no, say, Taliban or other strong
You
men?
mean in the
Yeah,
neighboring countries?
In the other stands.
There are not necessarily Taliban, but there is a danger, actually, and which was signaled. The presence of ISIS was definitely signaled in some of these republics. And some of these, very few, but there are a number of people from some of these countries who joined ISIS in Syria and Iraq to fight under the ISIS banner. Some Uzbeks and some Turks, Turkmens, and some Kazakhs, Muslim, who went to fight for them. But these countries has dictatorial, totalitarian regimes even today. They are led by ex-communists who are leading those countries when the Soviet Union was still around. And they stayed in power. They became democrats from one day to next. And like in most of these countries, so they stayed in power under a different label. And so they keep a tight lid on what's going on in their country. But you're right, in a way, there was a presence of ISIS, or a beginning of a presence of ISIS in those countries as well. Sorry? The demographics? What do you mean? Yeah, they are mostly Muslims. That being said, the older generation, obviously, they could not practice religion that much in the framework of the Soviet Union. So they discouraged to practice religion. So those people are mostly secular. Now you have a certain number, a minority of them, who practice religion, which is Muslim. But they are not encouraged to do so, much less than in the countries where you have religious leaders in power.
And they had no interest in joining the fight in Afghanistan. They just didn't. They
Once again,
stayed out.
the Taliban don't welcome people coming from outside. You will not find.
But I mean, the outsiders.
straight-
The outsiders had no interest in going in and protecting Afghanistan or joining the fray.
Well, there is no protecting Afghanistan from whom?
I don't know. Well, from the Taliban, I
Me
guess.
neither. But protecting Afghanistan, they fight themselves well enough to protect themselves as much as they can from foreign occupation or what they see as foreign invasion. But do not forget that Afghanistan is a very difficult country, geographically speaking, to rule. And you do have a central government in Kabul, but that central government is very weak. What you do have are warlords in many regions in those countries who are just as powerful as the central, if not more powerful, as the central government in Kabul. So they hold the power and they fight each other. There is no need for people coming from outside to add to the fighting. They fight, different factions are fighting each other along ethnic lines or along political beliefs. So there is no need to come from outside, number one. And as far as the Taliban are concerned, they are not interested, they don't need outside fighters to help them. They do well enough by themselves. Absolutely, yeah. They have except for again for ISIS, which preaches a sort of universal war against the rest of the world. It's us Muslims or believers in Islam, their type of Islam, against the rest of the world. So anything goes. And they welcome outside presence. That's why you have some Uzbeks and Tajiks and Turkmen who join the ISIS, like you had French and Americans and British who believe in their in that type of thing. But otherwise, the Taliban, again, it's an Afghan phenomenon, really. Yes.
Is there a sense how the Taliban will?
Can you speak into the microphone?
Is there a sense how the
Is there?
Taliban will treat women in the future?
All I can tell you is they made promises to the United States and to the rest of the world that even though they committed all these well-known abuses against women in while they were in power, the short period of time when they were in power, it won't happen again. So if you believe in giving a second chance, we'll see how that works.
So even though they're so young, they continue to have the attitude of the past. The youth haven't.
Well, that's what you call the attitude of the past. They call that religious belief. It's based on that's in a way is a danger with every state which is ruled according to the rules of Sharia, of the Islamic law, and based on the Quran. For them, it will never be obsolete. That's a way of that's a lifestyle. That's a way that a Muslim should conduct his business on a daily basis. So there is no discussion over what the Quran preaches. Whatever the Quran preaches is right. So you have black and white. There is no gray area. So it remains to be seen how this can be worked out. Again, the Taliban delegation, or whatever the Taliban sent to Doha to discuss it with Americans, made promises in that respect. They'll respect women, they'll be able to go back to attend school. And most of these women groups in Afghanistan, needless to say, are extremely skeptical about these promises. And also we have to see how this agreement or this balance, as I mentioned, on religious and secular institutions will work out in Afghanistan. Who will have authority over whom? You have something similar in Iran today. You have some secular institutions, and you had obviously the religious leadership. But the religious leadership has the ultimate authority in Iran. You have a president in Iran, and you have a prime minister in Iran. You have a parliament in Iran, which is elected on paper democratically. Now, there are criteria on which you can be a candidate for elections in Iran, but the lawmaker who gets the more votes, who has a majority gets a seat in the parliament. All right, so it seems democratic on the outside. However, Ali Khamenei is the supreme leader of the country, and he has the last word on everything going on in Iran, domestically, internationally, with a council of religious elders who help him. So that's the real power. That's what the real power is in Iran. That being said, there are some secular institutions also. And so it remains to be seen how Afghanistan or the government in Kabul will work it out with the Taliban. And you cannot rule out in Afghanistan also that, let's say, you have parliamentary elections in 1 year or 2 or 3. And again, since most of the present Afghan leaders have been tainted and accused of corruption by the Afghan people, they might very well elect a majority of Taliban members to the parliament, which in a way would give the Taliban much more freedom to act if they have a prime minister or a president again than since 2001. So again, it remains to be seen how this is going to work out, especially with the Americans gone, because it's more difficult to leave. But once you leave, it's almost impossible to come back in. It's almost impossible to come back in, unless, once again, I saw your hand. Unless there is a new terrorist attack on the U.S. soil planned in Afghanistan, then the U.S. could go into Afghanistan again. But that remains to be seen. It remains to be seen what the situation will be also in the United States at the time, what the opinion thinks, and so on. There are many questions for now. But since this is a campaign promise by Trump also to get out of Afghanistan, obviously he would like to honor this promise before November. So maybe sometime, that's politics. Any president or anybody would do something like that. But so the Taliban, in a way, they know exactly that the U.S. administration is in a hurry to get out of there. To be fair to Trump, he always said we should end this longest war in the history of the United States because it's not winnable, and it's not. All that the U.S., when at the peak of the surge, when you had 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, obviously militarily it helped. But it helped how? It helped by keeping the Taliban out of the major cities, but in the countryside. Well, it's easy for the Taliban to just melt in the population there. You won't find too many Afghans who are going to go to the American authorities and tell them, this guy is a Taliban. Because then you start a blood war between two families. And in Afghanistan, it goes on for generation and generation. The fifth or sixth generation doesn't even know why they have to kill the guy in the next village, but he'll do it because his grandfather, I don't know, they looked upon him in such a way that he felt disrespected. And you have to take into account the culture also that comes into, especially in countries like that. So, who knows? Well, you know, I'm not here to, I mean, to be, you wouldn't come if it, I have about 100 people. The only masochist people in Montclair and Montclair area are in this room every Monday. They love to hear bad news. Yes.
My question is this agreement that was worked out between the U.S. administration and the Taliban, how much support does this plan have amongst the Taliban populace, the supporters other than the leadership?
I don't even know how much support such plan has among the leadership, in the Taliban leadership. I don't know. There are a number of leaders who were in Doha to negotiate. But the question is, do they really represent the Taliban rank and file? I don't know. And how the rank and file will react to the signing of such an agreement, I don't know. For the time being, probably they'll go along with it because there are only advantages for the Taliban to go along with it. In other words, all they have to do is commit themselves to open negotiation with the government in Kabul, which they didn't want to do, but they can sit down at a table with the people in Kabul and don't agree on anything. They can maybe reduce the number of incidents between, but they will not disarm. So there are not really, when you look at it, in the beginning anyway, this is a deal between the U.S. from the Taliban point of view. This is a deal that the U.S., which is leaving, signs with the Taliban who are staying. It's not a bad deal for now, as a first step for the Taliban. When it comes to disarming and reintegrating into the society, that's where the difficulties start. Or when it's time to define the new type of governance that Afghanistan will have in the future, that's when the real difficulty will start. But for now, signing a deal with the U.S., which is leaving, it's okay. It's okay for the Taliban. The real problem will be when they start really negotiating face-to-face with the government in Kabul. And as a matter of fact, the government in Kabul was very much opposed to a deal between the United States and the Taliban, because they said, and they are still saying, we are left out. The U.S. was leaking some information to the government in Kabul, which was put in place by the United States, but did not give them any power over how to deal with the Taliban. The U.S. claimed, well, if we bring you in, you government in Kabul, you start fighting from the very first day across the table, and nothing will get done. Let us first sign a deal which will allow us, me, President Trump, also, to get our troops out of Afghanistan before the elections, preferably, and then you guys, you work it out among yourself. Now, is it going to work? No? Well, then again, we'll be back here many times to discuss Afghanistan. But this is just to tell you, that's the reason I picked up Afghanistan today. First of all, because a deal should be announced on Friday. So that's a big deal for the United States and for the administration to be able to claim, I'm getting you out of Afghanistan. No previous administration has done it since 2001. I'm ending the longest war in American history as president, and I keep my promise. That's a big deal for the United States, but it's a win-win only for the U.S. Leaves behind the Afghans, by telling them, exactly, it's their problem. But if they don't agree amongst themselves, it is also fair to say that whether the Americans stay or do not stay, at the end of the day, if the Afghans cannot find a way out of this, the U.S. can send in the Marines many, many times over. Nothing will work. It all depends if eventually they're going to make peace. And there are similar cases, not quite the same, but there are similar cases in Colombia, for instance, with the FARC. That war went on for a number of years. It is also true that the FARC were never in power in Colombia. They were just an opposition, a militia fighting the government. But they came to some kind of understanding by reintegrating some of the FARC people into the Colombian society. And even though that deal seems to be in question nowadays, as the FARC is trying to reassert itself in Colombia, it remains to, we'll see what happens in Afghanistan. Yes?
My question is, don't you usually negotiate with the sovereign nation? You just gave the example of the FARC, but I thought that was more of like a country negotiation. I'm confused about why the U.S. reached out to the Taliban, blatantly leaving the sovereign government out of the picture.
Once again, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I suspect that the main reason is that the U.S. wants to get out of Afghanistan, okay? And would like to get out of there before November, or at least to announce its withdrawal, even if on paper, again, there will be some troops left behind in Afghanistan, a token number of special operation forces left in Afghanistan, but the announcement will be spectacular and dramatic. Like we like to make this type of announcement. I'm the one who took our troops home. There was no reason to continue the war.
So all norms are off, in other words. The U.S. can go and negotiate peace with a non-recognized, I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad idea, but wouldn't it have been the norm to negotiate with the sovereign recognized government?
Well, the sovereign, as you mentioned, the sovereign recognized government of Afghanistan is the one put in place by the U.S. anyway. So all the U.S. can do is encourage the sovereign government of Afghanistan to negotiate with the Taliban, which the government has been trying to do for a long time, because militarily the government is much weaker than the Taliban. So that's another aspect of the problem. What do you do is when you don't have the U.S. Military backing anymore? So if the U.S. wants to, since the U.S. has been there for 18 long years and has been putting a lot of money into the government, to know the results are not extraordinary, the corruption is still there. The elections are contested. The authority of the central government doesn't go beyond Kabul. Yes, there was some progress made in that, again, there were some rights, fundamental rights for the citizens, which were put in place, particularly for women. But beyond that, in terms of nation building, the institution and the structures of a democratic government are not any stronger today than they were 10 years ago, 12 years ago, after billions and billions of dollars spent in Afghanistan. So, you know, the end result is not extraordinary, to say the least. Now, can such a ideal result can be achieved? Can it be achieved? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe not. The British couldn't. The Soviet Union couldn't. They didn't get into. They were smart enough not to try to get into the nation building aspect of it because it's very expensive. They just went in militarily, and when they realized that the situation is unwinnable, they pulled out. They declared victory and came home. Sorry? When they left, they invaded in the 80s and early 80s, and they got out at the end of the 80s after 5 or 6 years. What they're trying to achieve, they're trying to put in place their government, which was they brought in a government from a couple of Afghan political figures who went to school in Moscow, it seems to me, and they put in place a Russian-leaning type of government in Kabul. That's what they tried to achieve. I don't know if that's what they tried to do, to join the communist bloc per se, but they wanted to have an ally strategically in that area at the time. And when they realized that they put in place a government like the US, and that government was still in place when the Russians, Soviet Union at the time, said to them, goodbye. We are going because we're losing soldiers left and right. The freedom fighters here are killing us. The Mujahideen are killing us. And they were helped and supported by the United States. I'm not saying they were not Taliban at the time, but they were supported. The freedom fighters in Afghanistan got helped, weapons, money, through Pakistan from the United States, since Pakistan is supposed to be an ally of the United States. So they kept some of that weapons up to today in Afghanistan. So the fighting was going on, and the moment the Soviet Union left, the Russian troops left, the Taliban came in from Afghanistan. The civil war broke out between different factions and the government in Kabul, and the government fell a few months later. And that's 9/11. The Taliban came to power, and they hosted Al-Qaeda, and the rest is history, as you know. Then with Obama, bin Laden, 9/11, and then 2 months later, the Americans went in. And they've been there for 18 years. It's not a lot of success, nothing much to show for.
beyond the drug trade, what is the basis of the Afghan economy? I mean, are there any other goods and services that they
Beyond the,
beyond the drug trade?
but that's an important, that's
It's a big one. Yeah, but beyond that, are there any?
very lucrative. The U.S. has tried many times to discourage the peasants to plant all poppy and to make all this opium, but Afghanistan is still the leading producer of that stuff, which helps both sides, the government as well as the Taliban. So the U.S. is looking the other way today because there is not much to do. No, it's mostly agricultural projects. There is not much wealth, natural resources in Afghanistan. And even agriculturally speaking, they are relatively limited because, as you know, because of the it's a mountainous, not much. So again, to reintegrate, to reabsorb tens of thousands of prisoners today into the workforce in Afghanistan will be extremely difficult unless they have 50 million UN-sponsored conferences on rebuilding Afghanistan, which I don't know. There were some of them even before, but not too many donors who gave money, because it goes like in a black hole. It goes to Kabul and then it disappears. Yes.
Okay, you mentioned the warlords, and they are, very strongly powerful within
Yes.
Afghanistan.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how they fit into this whole picture. I mean, are they aligned with Taliban? Are they not aligned? The central government?
Some are not. They all have their own army, and I'm not even saying militia, real armies. Again, either along ethnic lines or political affiliation to one group or the other, but it's a very fluid situation. My friend one day, my enemy the next. So you never know who's aligned with whom and for what. But the reality is that they are ruling Afghanistan. So it's very difficult to speak of one Afghanistan. You have many Afghanistans in one country with a central government on paper, and now with two central governments on paper.
Right, because if the United States pulls out and is leaving it to the Taliban to negotiate with the central government does not have any influence other than in Kabul itself. And so are they going to negotiate? I mean, who is doing negotiating with whom? I mean, I just don't even know who makes decisions there.
Well, this is a question that come up from what I was trying to tell you for 50 minutes. Who's going to negotiate with whom? That's the relevant question. It remains to be seen. I mean, the leaders in Kabul are going to sit down with the chief, with the mullahs of Taliban and see what happens. But again, how the rank and file will react, the Taliban, I don't know. As for the Afghan army, I'm sure they'll be happy not to have to fight, because they don't really want to fight. So that's another issue, that militarily, after 18 years, and so many people who died and were wounded in Afghanistan, the US will basically pull out, not having achieved any of its military objectives. Some progress in the so-called democratic type of which they enjoy for now in Afghanistan. Again, particularly women. Okay? They go to school today in the villages in Afghanistan, which is, needless to say, huge progress compared to the previous regime. But beyond that, there is not much to show for. So maybe it is time to just take your losses and pull out. But this particular administration is definitely bent on pulling out before again, with a deadline. So, all right. Thank you very much. See you next week with another subject.